Hi, and welcome to this AI and C# video using the Microsoft Agent Framework. Today we're going to tackle a topic that is very confusing to almost everyone, and that is the infinite amount of different endpoints you have in Azure AI. Where do you use what, and so on. So let's get started. So before we begin, there's two ways of consuming Microsoft Foundry. You can either consume it as Microsoft would like you to do, using either the old portal with classic agents or new portal with the new agents, where their agents are persistent and you store data up there with the definitions of the agents are. But for many of us, we think Microsoft Foundry is not the way to go. So they also offer direct model usage. That has for a long time been called Azure OpenAI. The name is kind of obsolete now because there's so many other models, but we will get into that. But that is what we call direct model usage. So there's two ways of doing all this. And why is this difficult? Well, if you use OpenAI, you don't even need to put in a endpoint when you work with them. You just say, I want to have ChatGPT 5, and then you get it. With Azure, you're thrown in with a lot of things. So in a Microsoft Foundry or Azure Foundry, which was the old one, or if you had an Azure OpenAI resource by itself, they are now all called Microsoft Foundry. And I have a resource called Sensum 365 AI, and it's in central Sweden. And according to the old portal, I have a Microsoft Foundry endpoint, which is this one with a project at the end. I have an Azure OpenAI endpoint, which is this. And I have an Azure AI Service endpoint, which is this with the cognitive service, the old name of all of this. There's something speech to text and text to speech, but we will not go into those because that has nothing to do with the chat completion and the agents. But then if we go to the new portal, we get the same reference to the Microsoft Foundry endpoint with the projects and stuff, and that's okay. And that's the only one on the front page. Before that, all these were on the front page. But the Azure OpenAI Foundry is still there. You need to dig into the Operate tab to find it. But now it suddenly have a new name, which is just the same name as this, minus the /API project Sensum 365. But this name will still work in the old portal, so these two are the same, just with different names. And I understand they have removed the OpenAI part of it as much as they could. So what endpoint can hit what NuGet packages? So if we have the project endpoints, meaning name azureai.com/apis.project and then your project name, the Azure AI OpenAI NuGet package cannot work with this. It is only the Microsoft agents.ai.azureai.persistent that can work with the classic agents and the new Microsoft Agent AI Azure AI, which behind the scenes uses the project's NuGet package, that can use the new Foundry agents. OpenAI NuGet package cannot use this. Then we have the OpenAI endpoint, which is the most legacy of these. You can argue that the AI service is the most legacy, but this is the one that was before there was anything called persistent agents or anything. This can be used directly for model usage with the Azure AI. But you can't use it in the persistence, you can't use it in the new persistence, and you can't use it in OpenAI. Then there's Azure AI Services, which I had actually never used, but it seems like if you use it, you can still use the Azure AI. So it's a kind of second name. So this was the first name, this is the second name, and this is now the third name in all of this. But it can also do a direct model, but the two persistence cannot, and the OpenAI cannot either. And then there's the new name for Azure OpenAI Power. Yes, I know it is complicated, but that is the parent resource. You need to go into Interoperate tab, and then you find the name that service the data. And that can, of course, also use the direct model. That's what it's for. It's not for the work on the project level, because we don't have the project part of it. And OpenAI cannot use it either, the NuGet package. So this is the overview. So if you want to use direct access, you need to use the Azure OpenAI NuGet package, while if you need to do the persistence, either with old or new, you get these two. So that could be fairly simple to understand, except why in the world have I included this over here when none of it can happen anyway? Well, that is because there's a new recommendation from Microsoft. And it's been out since October that the Azure AI folks now recommend that we use basic OpenAI package instead of using the Azure AI Open package. And the main reason for that is that it's just a wrapper around it. It's actually the same team creating both of them, the Azure AI OpenAI and the OpenAI NuGet package. So it's not even OpenAI that makes their own NuGet package. It is Microsoft who does it. So now they're suddenly saying that we should use the OpenAI package despite it not working. And just a disclaimer, Agent Framework have not done this yet, but that's mainly a technicality because they still want to support the assistance API from OpenAI, which is now obsolete and cannot be used anymore. It was set to be deprecated on the 1st of January 2026, and since we have passed that, we don't have that anymore. But because they are extra sure that they want to work, they have not gotten rid of the Azure OpenAI client, and for that reason I haven't done it either in my Agent Framework toolkit as well. But there's a new way, and let's see that. So how can we consume it using the OpenAI package? Well, we need the endpoints like normal, so we can either use the OpenAI endpoint, the service.ai endpoint, which I will begin to use going forward, despite this being my original name for it. But since it works and it are the most generic of the names. But if you also want, you can also use the old cognitive service endpoint. And then you give your API key, your model, and some kind of message. And then you can do it like normal with the Azure OpenAI client, like we normally do, nothing new here. But if we want to use OpenAI, you can actually, at the end of this endpoint, put in /OpenAI/v1. And if you do that, it actually works with the OpenAI package. And that's the reason why this was just a wrapper, because the only thing it really did was add this on the fly, and then call the OpenAI package because it was dependent on it anyway. So there's no real reason why we need to have that package that's always a bit behind the OpenAI package anyway. So this is the new way of doing things going forward, but again, very new, and not even the Microsoft Agent Framework are using it yet, still in their examples. But we should begin getting used to this, and at some point, my Agent Framework toolkit will also switch to this. But in that tool, you wouldn't really notice. It will be behind the scenes. Just for reference, the old and the new Foundry with the project part, how they work, There are separate videos on it in more details. But in the old portal, you used Microsoft agents.ai.azureai.persistent NuGet package, and then you use Azure Identity for credentials, because both the old and the new Foundry cannot use an API key. You always need to log in using Azure role-based or RABAC. But if you do using that, in my case, I'm using Azure CLI. Again, other videos will explain this in more details. You get a persistent agents client, and that persistent agent client can create an agent, and that agent can then be consumed by the agent framework using, if you just give it its ID, and then you can ask like you normally do. For the new portal, they changed it again. So now it's Microsoft Agents AI.Azure AI, but again, identity, and now it's an AI project client instead of a persistent agent client, mainly because they put in versions and a few more features in it. But you can work with those, you can create an agent version, and you can create your agent, and then you get your agents, in this case by name, because names now are unique. You don't have IDs on them anymore. But again, more in other videos about this if you're interested in that. At the bonus of this video, what about then direct use of the non-OpenAI models? So there's a lot of models up in Azure, in Microsoft Foundry, like xAI, Mistral, DeepSeek, Cohere, Kimi, Meta's Llama, and Microsoft's own Phi models, and so on. So how do you consume those? Well, you do that in exactly the same way as we just saw using OpenAI, because they all use the OpenAI protocol behind the scenes, or compatible with the OpenAI protocol at least. So you just put in your system, use either the Azure OpenAI client or the OpenAI client. And model can be switched to Grok fast reasoning, Mistral small, DeepSeek, whatever they called, Cohere's models, and so on and so forth. So that's the way to consume that. There's one outlier, however, and Anthropic is always an outlier. I can see I've spelled it wrong, but it's still Anthropic. They don't support the OpenAI protocol, so Microsoft exposed that you can use this URL again, but now you can write /Anthropic. So now you have an endpoint that both have the word OpenAI and Anthropic in the same. So total confusion. But you can do it. And again, you could use the service AI and then use Anthropic. And if you do that, you can use the Anthropic NuGet agent, which the Anthropic client, which is just a NuGet package. And you can set the base URL to go away from normal Anthropic, but actually go to Azure instead. And if you do, you can set the normal model, the max tokens as is required, and then you can use it as an agent with direct use. So a little more difficult for them. Again, my agent framework toolkit have this supported as well. You simply just new up an Anthropic agent factory and give a base URL, and then it will work as normal. But that is everything. Again, very complex. You might want to stop the video at some point and see some of the samples here in order to understand. But the main part is that we should begin to use OpenAI client for everything that are not persistent agents. Use the persistent agents, of course, if you wish to do that. And for Anthropic, we have a slightly different way of doing it. But beyond that, this is the new recommended way, and never use the Azure OpenAI client anymore. So with that, thank you. See you in the next one.